Okay, I'm going to show you how to create your own skies now, and not just use the preset skies that come along with Vue. I have a new scene open, and I'm just going to go to Atmosphere, Load Atmosphere, and in here, like I said before, we can choose any of these skies, and there's quite a number of them, but if we go to Effects and Other, I'm going to select No Atmosphere, and this is going to reset everything so that I can show you exactly what everything is doing in the Atmosphere Editor. I'm going to go to the Atmosphere Editor by going to Atmosphere, Atmosphere Editor. You can also reach this button up here, the second one right here. You could also hit F4, and that will pull it up. I'm going to go over the standard model right now, the sky, and in here we can edit our sun. We can rotate it around, move its pitch, and all that. You can also change the size of the sun. I'm going to go ahead and actually, I'm going to close this out really quick, and I want to find the sun. If we just go up, our default for this specific preset, it has our sun all the way up in the top of the sky, but I'm going to move it right here just so we can see everything that's going on in our atmosphere. And I'm also going to turn off our lens flare for it so that we can really see all the options that are being made. Go back to our atmosphere editor, and what we can do under the sun is we can change the size of the sun, and as you can see, our sun is showing up in our preview window. And then we also have sunlight masked by clouds, but we don't have any clouds in the scene, so we're going to come back to that. I'm going to say no sun right now, because the best way to really make a good looking sun is to use a lens flare. Unless you're going for a specific round disk look, you can change your sun color and things like that. If I go ahead and change the size of the sun, you can see it. We can change the color of it to a red, and now you can see we have a red sun. We'll change it back to a golden yellow and say no size of the sun. If we go to our light options now, this is a little more advanced. This is going to get into radiosity and all that, and we're going to come back to that. So we're just going to skip to the sky. And now for a standard model, your sky is created by a gradient map or a solid color. If we double click on this color right here, we can go to daytime skies, sunset skies, or actually any of these will work for skies, but these are specifically for realistic looking skies. We can load any of these gradients in, dark, saturated, desaturated blue. Take a look at that, and now as you can see, as we go around, we have a nice gradient going up into the atmosphere here. But you also notice this is a sharp cutoff, so there's a way to edit that. What we can change is the map height, and that's going to stretch out our gradient up into the top. And as you can see, now we don't have that sharp cutoff in our gradient layer. There's a little bit of a cutoff, but not too much. We can also change our lowest altitude and bring it down even lower, or even higher if you want, and that will adjust your fall off for the beginning of the gradient. As you can see, we brought it up so high, it's just a solid color. As you can see, this also creates kind of a sharp fall off right here. As you can see, all the same solid color, and then the gradient starts. So if you bring down their lowest altitude, that won't happen. There's also sky color map distortion by the sun, and if we go ahead and find our sun right here and we start to pull this out, what it's going to do is center our gradient around the sun so that it's brighter around the sun and then darker as it travels away from it. And you can adjust the amount of that you want. You can go up really high, and that will make the gradient entirely around the sun, or you can go in between and it'll kind of swoop up just a little bit and kind of reposition it. I'm going to set it to none right now. And you can also change the fog in the sky with this. You can change the thickness and the max altitude. As you can see right here, we have a fog in here. I'm going to turn those off right now. And now we're going to go to our cloud layers. Now you can add pretty much as many cloud layers as you want, and in order to add a cloud layer, you just click add, and it's automatically going to give us our cumulus preset. But if we don't want this specific preset, we don't want cumulus clouds, we can go through our chooser and click on this arrow down here, and it's going to pull up our material chooser, and we can go to select clouds, and there's all different types of clouds in here. We have all the different types of cumulus in here, stratus, volumetric clouds, if you're working with a volumetric model, and then other clouds that you can also do with it. These top clouds up here are actually can be applied to primitive objects. so you can model specific cloud types and apply this to their material. And I'll show you that in just a little bit, but we're going to grab a cumulus down here. We'll grab this thick cumulus number 2 and click OK, and now you can see we have new clouds in our scene. Now we can adjust the scale of these clouds, of the actual texture map right here. So if I bring that down lower, you can see our clouds get smaller. But we can also adjust other settings for each cloud layer on the side over here. We have altitude, so we can adjust how high up the clouds are, and we can pull them down real low if we wanted to. The thickness near the horizon, how much the clouds show up near the horizon. We could turn that down, turn that all the way up. You can see they are a lot more thicker over here than if they were down at 46%. The overall cloud cover, and this is kind of a separate thing from our actual texture map. As you can see, it's adding extra clouds above our map that's already created. We can also change the density of our cloud layer. So if we want them to be dark or thicker, it's just pretty much making the clouds thicker. We also have a global exposure, and that will brighten up our clouds. So it says even down here, dark and bright, and everything is pretty much self-explanatory. If we go to light balance, we could adjust whether we want most of the light be caused by sunlight, or most of the light be caused by the ambient light, which is the light in the shadowed area of an object that's not directly lit. We also have the contrast for the clouds. We can say how defined we want them. And then we also have global illumination. As you can see, that's increasing our luminous of the set of each one of the clouds. And you can just make it a little bit brighter. And there's just all these little sliders to help you out and make you create better skies. You can just vary it as you want it to. We could also adjust how many clouds are near the sun. And since our sun is right here, I'll go ahead and preview render. You can see there's a cloud right on the sun. If we take that away, those clouds will kind of disappear. And that's the illumination near the sun. How much we want them lit up around the sun. As you can see, they're a lot brighter over here, but if we move off to the side and find some other clouds, you'll see that they're a lot darker. So that adjusts how bright you want them, their illumination near the sun. We could also go ahead and add another cloud layer, and then come down to this arrow, click on it, and we can select a stratus this time. And there's just all different types of ones we can choose from. We'll just dithered cirrus, we'll select that. And now you can see we have another cloud layer in the background here. And we can go ahead and edit those properties as well. How high the altitude is, and thickness, and all the same things that we had before. So you can just add multiple cloud layers, just one on top of another. Like I said, it's pretty much unlimited. And then if you want to, you could also turn off these cloud layers. If you've made a lot of changes to the settings and you don't want to delete it, because you might want to come back to it, but you're playing around with different settings, you can just click on the eye right there, and it'll turn it off and it won't show up in your render, but then you still have your cloud layer with all of your settings. We can also do in here is set up your cloud animation. And you can change the direction of which way your clouds are moving. And then you also have velocity, so how fast your clouds are moving across the sky, and then rate of change, which is pretty much how often their shape is changing and kind of boiling into themselves, and it's just a really neat effect. And if you really want to take a look at some of those, you can load in an animated atmosphere and take a look at that, and you can kind of see how that works. I'm going to move on to the fog and haze now. And I'm actually going to remove these cloud layers, or just turn them off, so that we can really see the fog and haze being created. If we up our fog, you can see it taking an effect in our OpenGL window, and also in our preview window. And we can go anything up to a thick fog. And we also have this fog profile, showing us a nice little graphic illustration of the fog. And you can adjust your fall off, and then you can see that showing up in here, and that will make an effect on your objects as well. If I would load in a sphere right now, I'm going to actually close this out right now and go ahead and find that sphere. Zoom out a little, there it is. Just so we can see the effect that the fog is having on this sphere. And we're going to have to go back and find our sun. There it is. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. You can hold down Shift and resize it. And if you don't want to hold down Shift, you can also click this little button right here, and that will automatically do the same thing that Shift will do. I'm going to turn that off because I like using Shift. If you can learn the keyboard shortcuts, it's definitely a plus because it will help you work a lot quicker. Okay, so now you can see the fog overlapping that sphere. I'm going to go back to our animation, or our atmosphere editor, and we're going to watch the preview window, and we can change the fall off, and you'll see that raises the cloud amount underneath it, and we can also change, like I said, the density, and that will go over the actual object. We can also change the altitude overall. As you can see, that's kind of engulfing our sphere, but we can change the density, and now we have a nice blending in between the two. We can also change the color of our haze. I'm going to pick something red so that we can really see the haze in there, and I'm going to turn off the fog, fall off, and up our haze, and now you can see we have a nice haze over the scene, and you can do a thick haze or no haze at all. And same thing with the fog color. If we turn off our haze and increase our fog, bring it down a little bit lower, we can go ahead and change that to any color we want. If we did like a blue, you can see that nice thick blue fog showing up in there. And keep in mind, this fog does not show up in our sky. But if we go to, where is it, sky right here, fog in the sky, and thickness and max altitude, it will kind of blend together with what's left, but it's not quite perfect, and that's where volumetric model is definitely the best place to do fog and things like that. We also have wind in here in your atmosphere editor. We're going to cover that a little bit later, but this is pretty much, it's pretty straightforward. If you look in here, you can just play around with the sliders and actually see this example of this plant moving around, and all of the plants in the scene can be affected by the wind. And this is specifically for plants, because nothing else can be affected by wind. But if we go back to our plant editor, there's actually an option for how much it's affected by our wind, and then whether or not we enable the wind on a per plant basis. We also have effects, and in the effects we can add stars, and you can't really see them too much because they are just 1 pixel. They're kind of showing up now, so we can add stars to the scene, and we can adjust the brightness of the stars, the twinkle, whether or not they have lens flares, whether or not they're colored stars. We can also turn on rainbow, and we'll have to find that rainbow in here. And because of the type of atmosphere right now, you can't really see the rainbow too well, but if you were to clear out the scene and just load in the rainbow, you'd be able to see it. I'm going to change the size and all that. And it's really not showing up just yet, just because we have all these stars in the scenes and different things like that. So I'm going to turn that off. We can also adjust the ice rings, which is going to go around our sun. And as you can see, we have these nice rings showing up in here now. We can adjust the intensity of those and the size of them if you want to. And then there's other different options for it. As you can see, we have these extra pieces coming out here, and the pillar in the center. So we could just do the pillar if we wanted to, and that adds a little bit more, and turn down our ice rings. So there's just lots of different options you can do with it. You can also load in a reflection map for your object, so they'll reflect this map and not the sky around them. And we'll go over that in just a little bit. You could also do that for, if you go to environmental mapping here, we can load an environmental map, which is an HDRI image. So you can load that in. You can also load in regular images too, but I would suggest using HDRI because it has more color information in it, and you'll get a much better look. And there's a preset or a scene that you can open up where it already has an HDRI sky or image loaded into it, and then you can play around with that. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. I'm going to go to atmosphere, load atmosphere, and we're going to go back to no atmosphere. And now we're going to take a look at the volumetric model. Now if we hit F4 and go to our atmosphere editor, as you can see, this blank model is a standard model. We're going to change the volumetric model, and I'm going to click OK, and as you can see, everything went black. And I'm also going to delete this sphere we have in here. But that's because our volumetric model is controlled by different settings. Go back to our atmosphere editor, and you'll notice that we no longer have our sky tab in here. And our sky tab before was controlling our color map, our gradient. Well, that's because our volumetric model is based a little more realistically, and it's based on mostly fog and haze. So if we lower those amounts, you can see it really take an effect on that sky. Or we could also adjust the color of the haze. And now we're getting a nice blue gradient in the sky here. And you can adjust the color of the haze, which will adjust pretty much your sky color. And you can adjust your fog levels. And as you can see, this is affecting the overall scene, both the sky and everything else in the scene, so the objects. And as you can see, the ground plane is turned kind of a white. You can also adjust the glow intensity of our sky. So if we turn these down really low and give it a real big glow intensity, and just up it just a little, you can see we have that nice glow in there. And a little bit much for the fog. So you want to kind of watch it when you're playing with these settings. You could also do volumetric sunlight. And we're going to go ahead and find our light now. And you can see our light up on the top of the screen. We also have the lens flare on it, so I'm going to turn it off. And go ahead and pull this down so we can see it a little bit better. And as you can see, it's also changing the color of our sky depending on where exactly our sun is in the scene. And it's getting a little greener. Go ahead and turn that off. If we pull it down below the horizon, there's a little bit of a change up here. And we could also still change the effects of our sun and its direction and all those same options. Also the size of the sun. And in the volumetric model, it's going to do an automatic sun color based on the actual atmosphere. So you won't have to worry about changing the color of it. And you also get, if we make it really big, instead of just a completely round disk, we get a nice fall off around the edges and a nice gradient blend. And light we really don't need to worry about right now until we're doing a full scene. And now we can also add clouds. And we're going to go and load in some of the volumetric clouds and click OK. And we can't really see them showing up too much here. We're going to up our altitude, and that's going to affect quite a bit. So what we want to do is change our density and just have them so they're showing up just a little. We can also change the scale to 1 and hit enter, which will close that out. So enter will not just go from one section right here. If I was to click enter right here, it wouldn't bring us to the next section. You have to use tab. It will automatically update what it is you're typing in, and hitting enter will close any panel you have open. So now you can see we can add our volumetric clouds in here and go ahead and add the same layers as we did before. We also have the same amount of effects, still have the wind, and it's pretty much the same settings as our standard model. I'm going to close this out, and now we're going to start to take a look at materials. Okay, I've gone ahead and cleared our scene out again and did a new one with pretty much our default sky. And I'm just going to load in a sphere now, and we're going to take a look at the material editor. Now, if you want a specific material to be applied to this, which is already preset, you can click this arrow and open up any of the presets, and you can also create your own. So if we go to personal materials, I don't have any right in here right now, but if we were to create some by using the material editor and then we save them, we could load them into our personal materials, and that will save them. So we could load in one of these if we wanted to, or we can go ahead and customize it completely in the material editor. I'm going to actually load one of these really quick and kind of work you through some of the options that were made to create it. And I'm going to select sand and double click on this preview up here, and we can see that this is a simple material. So under color, we just have a basic color on here, and most of this is being caused by a bump map. If we take a look at our bump map, now if you haven't worked in 3D before and you're not sure what a bump map is kind of faked geometry. And pretty much what it is a black and white image where white is the highest and black is the lowest. And it's the same thing before if you're creating terrains in another program, how you load those in. It's pretty much the same principle, except in the terrain editor, it's actually creating geometry. And here, it's fake geometry, because as you can see, we still have a perfectly round circle, but it appears as if there is geometry in here creating that surface. In here, if we double click on that bump, we can see we have this bump map loaded in here, and you can go through and actually pick any different type of bump map you want. There's all different types, and any of these will work as bump maps. Some of them are terrain altitudes, but they'll also work as bump maps. So we have spots and layers, and there's just all different types. And as you can see right here, this is pretty much the same one as our sand that we have right here. But we're going to load in this clipped lines, and now you can see we have an entirely different type of surface on here, and that's all being caused by the bump. We could also adjust the scale of our bump map. So if we set this to 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, you'll see that everything, there's a lot more geometry in here now, or a lot more of the bump map. You can really see it. You can also change the depth. So if we increase the depth there, you'll see that now our lines are cut more in, and we also have more of a little pattern on here caused by these bumps right here. And same thing works with the color map. Our color map right now is kind of a gradient, as you can see. If we double click on it right here, we have one of the gradients loaded in for that, and the sand gradient is on that. But we can select any of these, and it doesn't just have to be specifically for the terrain editor, things like that. We could load in the canyon, and now you can see we have that gradient across there. And there's also solid colors, and just all these different types of gradients to add on that. I'm going to click OK, and now we can see a preview of our ball in this preview window. I'll double click on it again and go back to our material editor. We're going to click on the highlight tab. Highlights are for specularity, so we can increase our highlights. We can see it's becoming a lot shinier on that preview. The highlight global size, so the size of the overall specularity. So you can also see down here it goes from dull to shiny. So it's pretty much your glossiness. If you're used to working with other programs, you can also change the anisotropic highlighting. And as you can see, we have an entirely different effect on here. You can also do variable highlighting, and with variable, you can go ahead and double click on this, and you'll get all of these different options, which you can also use these as terrain profiles, and I'll go back and show you that. But you can just add one of these variable things. I'm going to grab this one, so it'll really show you. And what it's doing is applying this to the overall intensity, so every other couple of steps, the intensity changes. And if I double click now again, we can go to a different one. You might be able to see a little bit better. Click OK. You can see that it's a lot brighter up here, and it's darker down here, and it's kind of curving along that specular highlight. So you can go ahead and change your variable highlights that way. You can also change the size of the highlight, doing the same thing, just grabbing one of these profiles, and as you can see that changed that. Or you could just use the default. And there's also constants and clips. I'm just going to close that out. We're going to move on to transparency tab. Now this is if you're creating glass and things like that. You can create transparency, and as you can see, we can see through the object now. We can also blur the transparency, so anything in the inside or we see behind it is blurred. We also have a refraction index, and if you're familiar with any small amount of physics at all, you'll know about refraction indexes. And this is based on the actual refraction index. And if you know any of the refraction indexes for anything, you'll know that 1.333 is water, and that will refract the light just like water refracts light. And 1.5 is glass. And you can go online and find charts and things like that for different refraction indexes of different materials. So there's one would be a vacuum, and actually air has a little bit of refraction to it, so 1.003 would be air, and there's just all different types of refraction indexes you can use, and that's all real world. refraction index. So you can go online and find that. You can also adjust the flare. So you can see that's increasing our specularity a little bit. And we could also create, this is for specifically for creating types of water, murky. So you can also use this for creating water types, which there's many presets for, but if you want to create your own, there's different murkiness levels you can adjust for that. You could also do additive, fuzzy, and there's just underlying material, variable transparency, and this works the same way as the highlights, where you can go ahead and grab a variable map right here, and we can grab this one, and that'll change our transparency overall. We could also adjust the blurring in that way, and then also the scale of that, and there's just all different types of things you can do with it. If we go back to our underlying material, it'll show us our procedurals and all that. Close that out, and then we take a look at reflections. If we want, we can reflect. I'm going to go back to transparency and turn off transparency, turn off fuzzy, additive, and now we can go to reflections. And now it's reflecting the sky in our scene. I'm going to click OK so we can kind of get a render here. And because we have all these other settings on right now, it looks a little crazy. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to our default material, so you can see that just a little bit better. And now we have that. Go back to our material editor, now we're back to our default setting. Go back to reflections, and now if I increase the reflection, you can see we have a nice metallic silver look, and it's going to completely reflect our sky and everything around it. So that's really neat looking for metallic objects, and you can add a little bit if you have water too. You can add to that. We also have effects. We can adjust our diffusion level and our ambient. Diffusion is pretty much how much the light is being diffused across the object. It's getting a little brighter in some sections. Ambient light, which is, if I turn off reflections, we can see this a little bit better. Let's see our diffuse, how much is diffusing light over the object. Our ambient, which is our shaded area, or the area that's not receiving direct light, so we can up the ambient level on that. If it's luminous, like a light bulb or something like that would be luminous. And also the contrast overall of that diffusion. You can see if we have a planet where we actually create a planet and not just use the planet preset that we have over here, we would want to up the contrast for it so we have a nice sharp edge. And color reflected light, so if we have reflection on, we can color it to whatever the surface color is for our actual object. And as you can see, now we have that default surface kind of blending in with our object, and that gives you a really neat effect. And you can go in and change all these other things too. Color transmitted light, and there's just lots of extra options for creating your own materials. I'm going to close this out now, and we're going to work with a mixed material now. I'm going to go and load in our default here, or actually, I'm going to grab a mixed material that we already have, and that is wet sand. Double click, and now you can see we have the mixed material tab, or a button selected up here, and you notice we have two separate materials, material 1 and material 2. If I double click on material 1, we pretty much have the exact same thing as we had before. It's that sand texture. And if I right mouse click up here, or go to options, we can change what we want our preview to be. If I change this to a sphere, you'll see that that's the exact same sand we had before. You can go to these options and change it to anything you want. Cloud, cone, cylinder, cube. And if you're working with terrains, cone's usually pretty good because it gives you altitude and all that. We're just going to do sphere right now to kind of show, because we do have a sphere in the scene. And we'll close that out. And that is our first material. And I'm going to click OK. And material 2, I'm going to change the options, change that to sphere as well. We can see that it's just a dark color. There's not too much to it. There's no bump map. It's just a procedural color. And you could also do, this works with a simple material, because this is a simple material. Mixed material is two simple materials. So if we double click on each one of these, we'll get our simple material for that. You could also change this to a mixed material and have a mixed material mixing with another material, and it pretty much goes endlessly, and you could just layer other ones on top of each other until you get some really neat looking effects. But with map picture, you can actually load in an actual image for a texture if you have seamless textures and things like that. And I'm going to show you that once we start working with our terrains. But I'm going to go ahead and click OK right now. And if we go to Influence of Environment, we'll notice that we have these two kind of blending together. But if we do distribution of materials dependent on local shape, altitude, and orientation, you can change these based on altitude and how flat the surfaces are. And this specifically works, well, not specifically, but it works best if you're doing terrains. And this specific material we have right now is not quite a terrain material. Our complex rock will give you more of an idea. If we go to that, we can see that it changes by the altitude. And we can change this, and as you can see, it's changing. We have one material on top. If we go to Materials to Mix, we can see this second material is actually on the bottom. And this one is also a mixed material, so it's blending along with this material. So we can see that this material is right here, and this material is right here on that half. And that is our mixed material for that first, for the overall mixed material. And the second material we're mixing is on the top part. So if we had a terrain, we would see changes overall. If we take a look at our sphere, we can also see that in our preview window. But I'm going to go ahead and load in a terrain, and we can take a look at what that actually does. And I'm just going to load in a simple terrain. And we don't need to worry about having a procedural right now to demonstrate this. But I'm going to load in that complex rock again and click OK. And we'll just wait for this preview window to start to... There we go. And now you can see we have our high points in the scene have that complex rock, or that top surface on it. And since we distributed them on the altitude, you can see on the bottom, now we have sort of that lighter surface, that's kind of sandy surface. So if I double click, we can also change the amount of how much it affects the altitude. So if I bring it down a little bit lower and click OK, we'll see a change on the surface. And as you can see, now it's mostly that top surface on there, and the other surface is kind of on, kind of gone. But we can increase it a little bit higher now, and we click OK. And we'll wait for that to render. And you can see it's a little bit higher up now than it was before. And you can go ahead and adjust that as high as you want. And now you can see it's much more defined up until that point. You could also change how much you want it to go towards a specific material, whether you want it mostly material 1 or mostly material 2. And if we click OK, we'll see that we're mostly towards material 1 right now, which is this bottom part. And we just see that just the tips are covered in that second material. So that's a really neat way to do it. We can change this back to a simple material for each one of the options. And then to create a mixed material out of that, just click Mixed Material, double click on Material 2, and that'll bring up a whole new material editor for that mixed material. So there's quite a bit you can do with it. You also notice up here we have whether or not our surface is one-sided, anti-aliased, whether it casts shadows, receives shadows, or only shadows. And then you also have your mapping mode, which you can set to world standard, cylindrical, spherical, and there's all different options there. And we'll go into that just a little bit later as far as the mapping. And pretty much the mapping is based on whether it's a world coordinates or coordinates specific to that object. We're just going to close out of this. It'll bring us back to our texture we had before. I'm going to go ahead and close that out. And I just want to bring up a water plane really quick. And we can take a look at the surface for this, and under transparency, as you can see, we have the global transparency really high, and of course our fade out color and our light color, and then all of our other options. And you could just play around with some of the presets. And the best way to really learn how to use the material editor is just to look at some of the presets that have already been made, and you can get an idea of how to do certain things. I'm going to close this out. And now we're going to actually take a look at creating a scene.